Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to leave the iron gates of Holloway Manor. For 190 years, the Holloway name has been whispered like a curse in the back alleys of Yorkshire. Not in the newspapers, not in official records, only in the breathless confessions of those who stumbled too close. The manor still stands, its windows like black, lidless eyes watching the village below. The air inside tastes of dust and iron. The walls, they listen. It begins in 1836 with the death of Nathaniel Holloway, though death is not the right word. His body was found in the study, perfectly preserved, as if sleep had paused his veins. No rot, no decay. And beside him, a diary, its ink fresh, its final entry written 3 days after his official time of death. The Holloways claimed it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error in the parish records. But the village gravedigger swore he saw Nathaniel buried twice. The first time in December, the second, 3 weeks later, in January. From that day forward, the Holloway estate was more than a home. It was a machine, a place that consumed the living and returned them altered, quieter, with the same dim stare Nathaniel wore in his coffin. Servants left and returned without memories. Guests vanished, their letters arriving to relatives with the same neat, unnatural handwriting. And the most disturbing part? The Holloway children never cried. If you think this is just another ghost story, you're wrong. Because the Holloway secret has nothing to do with spirits. It's older, deeper. It is the kind of truth you cannot unknow. And before we're done here, you will understand why some doors should never be opened, and why the Holloways never lock theirs. The first documented incident inside Holloway Manor came from the diary of a traveling physician, Dr. Elias Mercer. His journal was never meant for the public. It was seized by the Crown and locked away in the archives until a flood in 1912 brought it back into the light. Mercer writes of arriving at the estate in February 1841, answering a vague summons from Lady Eleanor Holloway. The letter, sealed in black wax, contained only 5 words. Your skills are required, urgently. When Mercer arrived, he found no signs of illness, at least not in the physical sense. The servants moved with eerie precision, their faces blank as though carved from wax. The halls were lined with mirrors, each draped in black velvet, and at the end of the great corridor, the door to the east wing was bolted shut, with heavy iron chains. Eleanor greeted him, not with pleasantries, but with a question. Doctor, how long can the human mind survive without dreaming? He would later write that her eyes looked like she hadn't slept in decades, but there was no fatigue in her voice. Instead, there was hunger. She led him to a small chamber in the basement, stone walls damp with condensation. There, tied to a chair, was a boy of about 12. His eyes darted back and forth in the dim light, but he did not speak. Mercer noticed dark stains around his temples and the faint scent of scorched metal. Eleanor explained, almost proudly, that the boy had not slept in 6 years, that her method had removed the need for dreams entirely. Imagine it, doctor, she said, a mind unclouded by the chaos of the subconscious, pure obedience, pure clarity. Mercer tried to examine the boy, but the child recoiled, trembling, not with fear, but with a strange animal rage. Then the boy spoke, voice hoarse and broken. They come when the lights are gone. When Mercer pressed for details, Eleanor's smile vanished. she ordered the servants to escort him out of the manor before nightfall. That was the last entry in his journal. No signet, no date, just a single line scrawled across the final page. They will never let me leave again. Beneath Holloway Manor lies a foundation unlike anything in 19th century England. The estate's original blueprints show nothing unusual. Simple stone cellars for wine, storage, and coal. But when the manor changed hands, after the Great Fire of 1864, workers unearthed something the plans never mentioned, a spiral staircase, descending far deeper than any cellar should go. The stone was older than the house, older than the town itself. Black, slick to the touch, and carved with symbols no mason could identify. Each step bore a single groove in its center, worn smooth by centuries of feet, but not human feet. The curvature was too shallow, the spacing wrong. At the bottom, they found a circular chamber, 40 feet across, its walls lined with alcoves. Inside each alcove stood a tall, narrow mirror, unbroken despite the damp and time. None of the mirrors reflected clearly. They shimmered like water, rippling slightly when one approached. The new owner ordered the chamber sealed immediately, claiming it was unstable. But workers reported hearing whispers through the stone weeks after it was blocked. Some said the voices spoke in their own names, asking them to come closer. Here's where it turns darker. The Holloway family archives, which the public never saw, include a parchment dated 1723, long before the manor's construction. It's a land deed, signed not by a person, but by a symbol. The very same symbol carved into the black staircase. This deed claims the land was consecrated to the Silent Ones, and any structure built here must serve their design. No record explains who or what the Silent Ones were. But in the margins, a faded note reads, "They dwell in the still water. The mirrors are their gates." From this point forward, the Holloways began incorporating mirrors into every corridor, every guest room, every study. Not for vanity, but for surveillance. Yet, the diaries of certain guests suggest the mirrors didn't just watch, they remembered. Visitors spoke of catching glimpses in their reflections, not of themselves, but of strangers watching them intently from the other side. And those strangers always seemed to be standing in the same circular chamber, the one beneath the manor. The first recorded ceremonial night at Holloway Manor took place in the winter of 1871. The guest list was small, 6 men of wealth and influence, each arriving under the cover of thick fog. Servants were dismissed early that night, save for a single butler, sworn to secrecy under penalty of permanent dismissal. No music, no dining, no idle chatter. The guests were led directly to the east wing, where every wall was draped in black velvet. Candles burned low, their flames trembling as if in a draught, though the windows had been sealed tight. At midnight, the butler was ordered to bring each man a small silver cup filled with a dark, unidentifiable liquid. No one spoke as they drank. Afterward, the butler was dismissed completely, but curiosity got the better of him. He lingered in the hallway, pressing his ear to the heavy oak doors. What he heard did not sound like men. It began with low murmurs, rhythmic and almost hypnotic. Then, a sound like water being disturbed, but slower, heavier, as if something vast moved in a deep pool. The murmurs grew louder, blending into voices that were not quite human, until they stopped abruptly. A single knock echoed through the hall, though no one had left the room. The butler fled. The next morning, the guest list was missing a name. The official story: one gentleman had retired early to his own home, but the butler swore he never saw him leave. Later that day, the east wing mirrors were covered with black cloth for the first time in Holloway history, and for the next 3 nights, muffled whispers could be heard behind the fabric. In later years, locals began to notice a pattern. Each ceremonial night ended the same way, with one guest absent, their name never spoken in town again. The Holloways never explained, but their wealth and influence grew with each disappearance, as if they were trading something or someone. By 1890, rumors had crystallized into a single terrifying belief. The Holloways were feeding the silent ones, and the silent ones were paying in power. The Holloway mirrors were unlike anything you'd find in an ordinary home. Imported from Venice in the mid-1800s, each was framed in ornate gold leaf, carved with twisted figures that looked almost alive in flickering candlelight. But after the first disappearances, they took on a different reputation entirely. Servants whispered that sometimes, late at night, the covered mirrors would move. Not sway, not shift in the wind, but pulse, like the surface of water. The more superstitious staff refused to enter the east wing after dark, claiming they could hear faint tapping coming from behind the cloth. It was one of the new maids, Mary Coyle, who made the first forbidden mistake. One night in 1891, she stayed behind to finish polishing silver. Passing the east wing, she noticed one of the mirror covers had slipped. Just a sliver, but enough for moonlight to catch the glass. Against her better judgment, she looked. What she saw was not her own reflection. The figure was taller, dressed in clothes 30 years out of fashion. His skin was pale, eyes black and bottomless, and his lips did not move. Yet she heard his voice in her head. "Tell them I'm still here." Mary dropped her polishing cloth and ran. She left Holloway Manor that night, never collected her final wages, and was found days later wandering the edge of Blackwood Forest, muttering to herself. The only phrase anyone could make out was, "Don't drink the water." Over the next 2 decades, others reported similar encounters. Guests who stayed overnight claimed they saw unknown faces peering over their shoulders in the mirrors, faces that did not vanish when they turned around. And always, the same feeling lingered, as though someone, or something, was trapped inside, watching from the other side of the glass. By 1905, the Holloways had covered every mirror in the manor permanently, but no one believed it was to protect the living. No, the covers were to keep whatever was inside from getting out. It was the winter of 1912 when the Holloway estate prepared for its grandest gathering in decades, a masquerade ball to celebrate the engagement of Margaret Holloway, the last unmarried daughter. Invitations were sent across the country, carriages lined the drive, and the manor glowed with hundreds of candles. But amid the finery and music, there was one dangerous oversight, or perhaps a deliberate act. When the guests entered the ballroom, the first thing they noticed wasn't the champagne or the orchestra. It was the gleam of glass. The east wall's towering mirrors, once hidden for years under heavy velvet, were uncovered, their polished surfaces catching the golden light. At first, no one thought much of it. The mirrors simply reflected the dancers in 1,000 flickers of silk and shadow. But then, small inconsistencies began to surface. A gentleman swore he saw his reflection blink before he did. A lady claimed she caught her own likeness, whispering to her, though her lips never moved. Midway through the night, the orchestra faltered. Violin strings snapped in unison, the pianist's hands froze midair, and a strange hush spread through the room. One by one, every guest turned toward the mirrors. The reflections were gone. The mirrored ballroom showed no dancers, no chandeliers, no swirling gowns. Only a cold, empty version of the room, lit by an unnatural silver glow. And then, shapes began to emerge in that other ballroom. Dozens of pale figures, dressed in outdated finery, their faces a mix of grief and rage. Gasps turned to screams as these reflections began to move toward the glass. Some pressed their hands against it. Others pounded, their mouths stretching open in silent wails. The glass trembled, thin cracks webbing across the surface. A sudden, sharp sound, like ice shattering, echoed through the room. One of the smaller mirrors fractured completely, spilling shards onto the floor. But the shards didn't just lie there. They twitched. Panic erupted. Guests stumbled over one another to flee the room. But in the chaos, a count of attendees revealed that 2 men and 1 woman never made it out. Their names would never be uttered again in polite company, and their faces would never be seen in this world. The next morning, the mirrors were covered once more, but the cracks remained. Beneath the velvet, still breathing. After the masquerade, Holloway Manor changed. Servants whispered in corridors, their footsteps quickening whenever they passed the eastern ballroom. Curtains over the mirrors were nailed shut, not just draped, as if to keep something in, not out. But the truth was far older than any servant's memory. Rumors began to leak, traced back to a single drunken stable boy who'd been in the Holloway service for nearly 20 years. He claimed the mirrors had been installed not as decoration, but as gates. In 1843, long before the ball, Patriarch Edwin Holloway had journeyed to the Black Forest of Germany. His wife had died giving birth to their 3rd child, and he had returned with something strange, a gift from a man known only as the Collector. This man dealt in objects older than written history, relics from civilizations erased from maps, tools crafted for purposes no human mind was meant to understand. One such relic was a set of 12 mirrors, framed in black iron, their glass polished to an unnatural clarity. They were said to be made from volcanic obsidian mixed with the ash of human bone. The Collector had warned Edwin, "Do not place them where the living gather. They show more than your face." But Edwin was a proud man, hungry for whispers of immortality. The Holloway bloodline had been plagued for centuries with tragedy, early deaths, madness, disappearances. The mirrors, he believed, could change their fate. The bargain was simple, or so it seemed. Place the mirrors in the East Wing. Once every 20 years, uncover them for a night, and let the reflections choose their replacements. Those taken would vanish without a trace, but in exchange, no Holloway would die of illness, old age, or accident before their chosen time. The Holloways accepted. And the cycle began. The ball of 1912 had been one such night. But the problem was this. The mirrors had been uncovered by accident. It was not the Holloways' choice. The glass had not yet fed, which meant the spirits behind it were starving. And when a pact is broken, the payment becomes unpredictable. The stable boy swore he had seen something worse in the days after the ball. In the dead of night, the curtains over the mirrors moved, not outward, but inward, as though being pulled by something inside. The first to disappear was Margaret Holloway. It happened 3 nights after the ball. She was seen retiring to her chambers by her lady's maid at precisely 11 o'clock. The door was locked from the inside. But in the morning, when the housekeeper came to fetch her, the bed was untouched, the sheets pristine, the pillows undisturbed. The only clue was a faint frost on the glass of her vanity mirror, as though the room had been plunged into winter for a single breath. In the center of that frost was the unmistakable outline of a hand, pressed from the inside of the glass. Panic spread, but the Holloways refused to call the police. They told the staff that Margaret had taken a sudden trip to London for medical treatment. Yet the servants knew better. Margaret's perfume still lingered in the hallway. Not faint, but fresh, as though she'd just walked past. And sometimes, in the corner of their eyes, they saw her reflection where she shouldn't be. In the silverware, the marble tiles, the black surface of a teacup. Then, it was Thomas Holloway, the family's youngest son. He was a war hero, celebrated for his service in the Boer War. Strong, sharp, unshaken by fear. And yet, one night, he was found kneeling before one of the covered mirrors, whispering in a language that no one recognized. The butler swore the boy's voice didn't sound human, deeper, layered, as though several throats spoke in unison. When they dragged him away, he laughed, a sound like shattered glass scraping across stone. The next morning, his bed was empty. His room was locked. By the end of the week, 5 Holloways were gone, and each time, the mirrors grew clearer. The dust that once clung to their frames vanished. The glass became sharper, almost liquid in appearance. It was then the matriarch, Eleanor Holloway, realized the truth. The mirrors weren't just feeding, they were awakening, and now they no longer waited for the 20-year cycle. They were taking at will. The pact had broken, and with it, the rules had dissolved. Every night, the manor felt colder. Doors opened into rooms that didn't exist the day before. Footsteps followed from empty hallways, and in the dining room, one mirror had begun to show a version of the Holloways still inside the glass, smiling, moving, watching. But their eyes were black. Eleanor Holloway was not a woman of superstition. She had grown up in an age where science was becoming the new scripture, where reason had replaced ritual. But that winter, as the mirrors grew restless, she abandoned reason entirely. One night, after the house had gone silent, she crept into the dining room with a fire poker in hand. The largest mirror, 7 feet tall, framed in black walnut carved with serpents, stood before her like a silent judge. Her hands trembled as she raised the iron rod. The glass shimmered faintly, not reflecting her, but showing an empty dining room. The same room, but lifeless, colorless, drained. She swung. The sound was not the crash of breaking glass, but a deep, hollow thud, like striking water. The rod didn't pierce. It sank. Only for a second, but she felt it. The cold, the pull, as if the mirror had gripped the metal. When she yanked it free, frost had formed along its tip. Then, the mirror breathed. A film of mist rolled across its surface. Shapes began to take form within it. Faint, shadowed figures stepping closer from a void. Faces emerged. Margaret, Thomas, the others. They stood inside, pale, lips moving in silent pleas, but their eyes were vacant. Eleanor's resolve broke, but she swung again, harder. This time, the rod struck with a crack. A spiderweb fracture spread across the glass, and for a heartbeat, she thought she had won. Then came the scream, not from the mirror, but from within her own mind. It was deafening, violent, like a chorus of voices clawing their way into her skull. Her knees buckled. She clutched her head, the iron rod clattering to the floor. The fracture in the glass began to knit itself back together, as though healing. And then, the figures inside the mirror stepped closer. A voice, not hers, not human, spoke aloud in the empty room. The pact cannot be broken, only passed. nor understood in that instant. The mirrors weren't bound to the Holloways. They were bound to the land. Destroying them was impossible, unless the curse could be transferred, willingly. And so, a new choice emerged. She could fight until the house devoured her family entirely, or she could choose another bloodline to take their place. For 3 nights, Eleanor didn't sleep, not because she feared what would happen if she closed her eyes, but because she was listening. The manor was never truly silent. Beneath the groans of the old beams and the wind clawing at the shutters, there was a rhythm, a slow, deliberate pulse, as if the house itself had a heartbeat. She walked the halls barefoot, her candle trembling in her grip, tracing the sound as it traveled from mirror to mirror. The whispers had changed. They no longer repeated fragments of Holloway tragedies. They whispered names. Names Eleanor didn't recognize. Men, women, children, all spoken with reverence, as if being recited from some hidden ledger. On the 4th night, the whispers stopped entirely. In their place came a single commanding sentence. "Bring them here." Eleanor knew what it meant. The curse had offered her a bargain. Not salvation, but exchange. If she could lure another family to the manor, the pact could be fulfilled. The mirrors would feed on fresh blood, and the Holloways could finally be free. At first, she resisted. The thought of condemning strangers to the horrors she had endured made her stomach twist. But resistance in Holloway Manor was like trying to hold back the tide with your hands. The house pushed. It began small. An advertisement in the local paper about the grand old estate for sale, posted without Eleanor's knowledge. Letters sent under her name, offering hospitality to distant acquaintances she had never met. And then, the dreams. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw a road stretching into darkness, and at the end, a family carriage arriving at her gates. A father, a mother, 2 children, their faces always obscured, their laughter carried on the wind. By the end of the month, she had chosen. Not out of malice, but out of survival. The family was wealthy enough to be tempted by the prestige of the manor, eager enough for status to ignore the rumors, and cruel enough in reputation that she could tell herself they deserved whatever came for them. When she sent the letter of invitation, her hand barely shook. She didn't yet realize that the mirrors had been whispering those names for years, that this family wasn't random at all. They had been chosen long before Eleanor ever knew the curse existed. The day the carriage arrived, the sky hung low and swollen with clouds, as if the heavens themselves wanted to watch what was about to unfold. Eleanor stood at the tall, arched window of the East Hall, her breath fogging the glass. The road below wound like a black vein through the forest, and there, just as in her dreams, it came. The carriage, lacquered black and trimmed with gold, its wheels slicing through the wet gravel. 4 horses, their flanks steaming in the cold air. She watched them climb out one by one. The father, a tall man with a sharp hawk-like face and eyes that moved like a predator's. The mother, pale, elegant, her posture carved from ice. The son, no older than 10, with restless hands and a stare too old for his age. The daughter, a silent shadow, her hair hiding her expression. Eleanor's heart didn't pound. It sank. Behind her, the mirrors hummed. Every pane of glass in the manor vibrated with a low, resonant note, like the pluck of an unseen string. She knew the house was awakening. The smell of the air shifted. An old scent, damp earth mixed with something metallic. As the family stepped into the great hall, Their voices echoed unnaturally long, each syllable stretching as if the walls themselves were tasting the sound. Eleanor greeted them with the hollow warmth of a host playing a part. Her eyes lingered only briefly on the little girl, who, she noticed, avoided looking into any mirrors. Dinner was served in the grand dining room. Candles burned low, their flames bending slightly toward the guests. The silverware clinked in strange syncopation, like a faint heartbeat beneath the table. The father spoke of business and titles. The mother complimented the house's charming age. The son wandered away twice, returning with dust on his hands, but it was the daughter who unsettled Eleanor most. At one point, the girl turned to H and whispered, "They're already inside." Eleanor's breath caught. Before she could respond, the girl's mother called her name sharply, and the child fell silent. That night, the family was shown to their rooms. The mirrors along the hall seemed to tilt ever so slightly toward them as they passed. Eleanor stayed awake long after the candles died, listening to the soft, hungry whisper that rolled through the house. The exchange had begun. It began, as it always did, with small violations. The father was the first to feel it. He awoke before dawn, certain someone was in his room. The fireplace, which had been cold when he'd retired, was now burning low, though no servant had been ordered to light it. A glass of brandy sat on the table beside his bed. He hadn't poured it. He hated brandy. Still, some part of him drank it without question. The mother's turn came hours later. She was in the dressing room, brushing her hair before a gilt mirror. But with each stroke of the brush, her reflection lagged, just for the briefest moment. She leaned closer, certain she was imagining it. And then her reflection's lips curved in a smile her real face did not wear. She dropped the brush. When she picked it up, the reflection was normal again, but her skin was damp with sweat, as if she'd been fevered. The son's ordeal was stranger still. He had been exploring the West Wing, a part of the manor Eleanor never entered, when he found a door ajar. Inside was a study lined with tall bookcases. The air smelled faintly of mildew and ink. On the desk lay an open ledger filled with names, hundreds of them, written in the same slanted, spidery hand. Some names were crossed out, others had faint red smudges beside them. He turned to leave, but found the door shut behind him, though he hadn't heard it close. And the daughter. She didn't need the house to torment her. She seemed to already know its rhythms. That afternoon, Eleanor found her in the long gallery, standing before a full-length mirror, whispering to it. Eleanor couldn't hear the words, but the mirror whispered back. By nightfall, the house had marked them all. Eleanor could feel the shift, the same subtle current she had felt with every previous family. It was not the overt malice of a predator attacking prey. It was more intimate, like the slow wrapping of silk around a throat. She walked the halls long after they'd gone to bed. The portraits seemed to follow her, their eyes wide with something between hunger and anticipation. Somewhere deep in the house, a door creaked open on its own. The house was testing them, deciding which thread to pull first. The storm rolled in without warning. No wind, no distant thunder. Just a sudden blanket of black clouds swallowing the moon. The manor seemed to straighten in the dark, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Eleanor had been in the library, cataloging the Holloway ledgers, when she felt it. The subtle vibration beneath her feet. Not an earthquake, not footsteps. More like the deep, slow heartbeat of something beneath the house. Upstairs, the family slept, or tried to. The father was the first to break the silence. His shout echoed down the corridors, raw panicked, animal. Eleanor dropped her pen and ran, skirts gathering dust from the old rugs. She found him in the master bedroom, standing in the farthest corner like a child, staring at the bed. The sheets were pulled tight, too tight, as if someone, or something, had wrapped them around an invisible form lying there. The impression was clear, a human shape, long and still, its head resting perfectly on the pillow. The fabric rose and fell, breathing. But when Eleanor moved closer, the shape flattened into nothing, and the sheets hung limp. The mother's turn came minutes later. She was in the corridor, pacing barefoot, muttering, "Where is she? Where is she?" When Eleanor asked who she meant, the woman turned with glassy eyes. "My reflection," she whispered. "It left." In the children's rooms, the unease had become chaos. The son's window had been flung open despite the stormless night. His bed was covered in dirt, not the light dust of the garden, but thick, black earth. Earth that smelled of rot and worms. The daughter was not in her room at all. They found her at the far end of the west wing, in that same locked study the boy had discovered before. She stood before the desk, the ledger open to a fresh page. A single candle burned beside her. She was writing in that same slanted, spidery font. Only she wasn't holding a pen. Her fingers traced the paper, and the ink formed beneath them. When Eleanor pulled her away, the child fought like a feral thing, teeth bared, shrieking words Eleanor didn't understand. The storm outside finally broke. Thunder cracked. The candle guttered out. In the sudden darkness, Eleanor realized the house had made its choice. It would start with the girl. The manor was utterly silent after the candle went out. But it wasn't peace. It was the suffocating quiet of a predator right before it strikes. Eleanor gripped the girl's wrist, pulling her toward the hallway, but her skin was cold. Not chilled by air cold, corpse cold. The child's eyes were wide open, pupils swallowing the iris, until they were nothing but two black voids. From somewhere deep in the walls came a low groan, almost like the creak of settling wood, but too deep, too deliberate. It followed them, room by room, as if the house itself were moving with them. They passed the nursery, and that's when Eleanor saw it. A shadow, standing perfectly still in the corner, not cast by furniture, not shaped like any human. It was too tall, its head brushing the ceiling, its arms hanging longer than they should. She froze, but the girl didn't seem to notice. Instead, the child whispered something in a voice that wasn't hers. It was lower, older, and it vibrated in Eleanor's chest. "Father called. I must go." Eleanor spun toward the master bedroom. The father was on the floor, knees drawn to his chest, rocking and muttering. But his eyes were locked on the doorway, unblinking, as if watching something approach from behind Eleanor. She dared to glance over her shoulder, and found nothing. But the air was wrong, thicker, hot, like breath against the back of her neck. Then the floorboards began to move. Not creak, not shift. Breathe. Long drawn inhalations through the wood, the kind that make your own lungs instinctively slow to match. The girl pulled free of Eleanor's grip, moving toward the center of the room. She knelt, placed both hands on the floor, and whispered again, "I'm home." The boards split open, not wide, not violently, but in a slow, wet parting, as if the house had been keeping a mouth shut for far too long. The smell that rose was unbearable. Damp rot and something metallic, sharp, almost sweet. The father screamed and scrambled into the corner, but the girl didn't resist. She let the darkness inside the floor rise, curl around her ankles, and pull her down. By the time Eleanor lunged forward, the wood had closed again. The girl was gone. Eleanor staggered backward, staring at the spot where the floor had sealed. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. But the father's voice cut through the fog, raspy, broken, and filled with a terror she had never heard in another human being. "It knows you now," he whispered. Eleanor's eyes snapped to him. "What?" The man's hands trembled violently as he pointed, not at her face, but at her chest. "It heard your heart. You fed it." She didn't understand until she noticed the change in the room. The silence was gone. In its place was a low, rhythmic sound, perfectly timed with the beating in her rib cage. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't an echo. It was something else, syncing with her heartbeat. Her throat went dry. "Where is it?" she demanded. The father's eyes shifted toward the walls, not one spot, all of them, as if whatever was here had no single shape, or perhaps it wore every shadow in the room. "You shouldn't have spoken," he said, voice cracking. "The moment you asked where it was, it came closer." And then she heard it. Her name, spoken in a wet, whispering drawl that stretched the syllables too long. Not from the floor, not from the walls, from inside her own skull. Eleanor clapped her hands to her ears, but it didn't stop. In fact, the voice seemed to enjoy her panic, the way a predator enjoys watching prey run in circles. She spun toward the door, but when she tried the knob, it didn't turn. The wood around it had swelled, veins of dark moisture snaking down toward the floor, as if the house itself had grown muscle. The father began to sob, rocking harder now. "It wants to keep you. The house always keeps the ones it likes." Her skin crawled. She backed toward the window, only to see the glass fog over, her own reflection staring back at her with eyes that were not her own. In the reflection, her mouth moved without her control. The voice spoke again, this time from both the mirror and her mind. "Stay. We've waited for you." Eleanor's breath came in shallow, frantic bursts. The window, her only hope, was now just another trap, her reflection smiling at her, with a mouth that moved like a puppet's. She took a step back, refusing to look into those other eyes, and lunged for the door again. This time she threw her entire weight into it, shoulders slamming against the wood. The door gave a groan, but it wasn't the sound of splintering. It was the sound of breathing. The wood seemed to flex under her skin, warm, almost pliable, as though her hands pressed into the muscle of a living creature. And in the moment she recoiled, the door simply vanished. In its place was another hallway. Eleanor's stomach turned. She had walked this corridor before, just moments ago, but now it was wrong. Too long, too narrow. The wallpaper's patterns twisted in slow, writhing spirals, shapes blooming that she could swear resembled eyes. Somewhere ahead, footsteps. She froze. They weren't hers, slow, deliberate, heavy, as she turned to run back, but the hallway behind her had shifted too, the entryway dissolving into another door that she didn't recognize. A door that opened before she could decide whether to approach it. Inside, the father's voice, though she knew he hadn't moved from the room she'd left. "You can't leave, not unless it lets you." Her mind raced. This wasn't a house anymore. It was playing with her, testing her reactions, changing its bones with every move she made. She walked forward carefully, eyes darting along the walls, trying to find something solid, something real. But each step brought a new distortion, a picture frame melting at the edges, the carpet beneath her feet rippling like water, the faint smell of soil and rot rising with every breath. And then, at the far end of the corridor, she saw it. A shadow that didn't match anything in the room. Tall, human-shaped, but wrong. The limbs tambishan nampani, oolong. The head cocked at an unnatural angle, like it was studying her. She blinked, and it was closer. Her voice caught in her throat. She stepped back once, twice, then turned and ran, not caring where the house threw her next. Behind her, the footsteps followed. She ran until her lungs burned, her heart pounding like a war drum against her ribs. But no matter how far she moved, the air carried the scent of that shadow, coppery, metallic, like old blood baked into stone. Her sprint slowed to a stagger. The corridor she was in now was narrow enough for her fingertips to brush both walls. Candles burned in sconces along the way, their flames unnaturally still, not flickering even as she passed. One of the walls was lined with portraits. Each face was gaunt, pale, and solemn. Men, women, and children, with the same deep-set eyes, the same sharp jawline. The Holloway bloodline. She felt drawn to one in particular, a boy of no more than 12, his gaze direct, unblinking. The plaque beneath read, Thomas Holloway, 1843-1855. Her stomach dropped. She knew that name. It had been in the records she found earlier in the village archive. Except the archive had claimed Thomas had died in infancy. As she leaned closer, the paint of the portrait began to move. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. Thomas's lips curved into the barest smile. Her body froze. In that moment, the candles along the wall flared, shadows surging and writhing across the hallway, like living ink. The boy's voice, thin and chilling, slid into her mind, not spoken aloud, but inside. The manor breathes because we do. Our blood feeds its heart. Our deaths bind its soul. Images slammed into her, of the Holloways standing in a circle in the great dining hall, chanting in some guttural, inhuman tongue. Blood spilled onto the floor, seeping into the cracks. The walls pulsed in response, like veins feeding from the sacrifice. She stepped back, her shoulder hitting the opposite wall. The boy's eyes in the painting glistened now, reflecting her own horror. "You've already given it what it needs," he whispered. She touched her neck instinctively, feeling a warmth that hadn't been there before. Her fingers came away red, not from a wound she remembered getting. The realization rooted itself deep. The manor didn't just trap people. It drank them. Slowly, patiently. It would never let her leave until she was part of it, just like every Holloway before her. And then she heard the heavy footsteps again, closer. The footsteps weren't coming from above this time. They were rising from below, a slow, deliberate cadence, each thud vibrating through the floorboards under her shoes. Eleanor's breath caught. The corridor had ended in a door she hadn't noticed before. Iron, riveted, and stained in patterns too dark and irregular to be rust. It was unlocked. The hinges groaned as she pulled it open, revealing a stairwell spiraling downward into blackness. The air that rose to meet her was warm, damp, and carried a faint, sickly sweetness that made her throat tighten. She descended, her hand sliding along the cold stone wall for balance. Each step seemed to stretch longer than the last, as though space itself warped beneath her. The sound of the footsteps persisted, but now they echoed differently, not like boots striking stone, but like something wet, dragging itself forward. The staircase opened into a vast chamber. No walls were visible, only darkness stretching outward in every direction. In the center stood a structure that pulsed faintly, like a colossal organ, alive and breathing. Its surface was a patchwork of skin, stone, and sinew, each layer fused together in grotesque harmony. Veins, actual veins, snaked outward into the ground, vanishing beneath her feet. The heart of Holloway Manor. As she stepped closer, the air seemed to thicken, resisting her movement like invisible water. She saw movement within its walls, faces pressing against the translucent, fleshy surface from inside. Their mouths opened in silent screams before dissolving back into the pulsating mass. She recognized some from the portraits upstairs. Holloway ancestors, trapped, feeding it. And then, another face emerged, her own. She stumbled back, nausea twisting through her gut. But the heart's pulse grew stronger, beating in sync with her own racing pulse. Her temples throbbed as whispers filled the chamber. Not one voice, but hundreds, overlapping in a choir of agony and command. You are already claimed. Something began moving inside the heart, forcing its way toward the surface. The mass split open with a sound like tearing leather, and a figure stepped through. Human in form, but draped in living shadow. Its eyes were black voids, but she felt them pierce through every layer of her being. You've descended too far to climb back, Eleanor, it said, its voice a perfect blend of all the Holloways who had ever lived. Now you choose, feed the heart, or become it. Eleanor's first instinct was to run, but when she turned, her legs felt like they were wading through molasses, every movement slow, heavy, as though the air itself had decided she would not leave. The figure stepped closer, and the shadows that clung to it slithered forward like searching tendrils. They wrapped gently around her wrists, her throat, not constricting, yet, but holding her in a way that made escape seem impossible. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The heart at the center of the chamber beat with it, matching her rhythm until she could no longer tell which pulse was hers and which was its. The figure tilted its head. It doesn't matter if you believe, Eleanor. Belief is irrelevant. The Holloways were chosen because they were weak enough to think they had a choice. She clenched her teeth. I'm not one of you. A low chuckle rippled through the chamber, not from the figure's mouth, but from the walls, the floor, even the air. Not yet. A sudden flash of pain exploded in her chest. She gasped and looked down. Veins were rising beneath her skin, dark and branching, glowing faintly like embers under flesh. She clawed at them, but the harder she scratched, the more they spread, crawling up her neck, her arms, into her face. The whispers grew sharper, turning into commands. Kneel, serve, feed. She staggered backward until her heel caught on something, one of the vein-like roots protruding from the floor. It pulsed once beneath her foot, and then shot upward, coiling around her leg like a snake. She screamed, but the sound didn't travel. The shadows swallowed it whole. The figure extended a hand, not in violence, but in invitation. Surrender is not defeat. It is inevitability. She shook her head violently, fighting to keep her thoughts her own. She thought of the world outside, the cold Vermont air, the sound of rain on her apartment roof, the small moments of life that had nothing to do with this place. She latched onto them desperately. The heart reacted violently. Its beat quickened, the faces pressing harder against its surface, mouths gaping wider. The figure's voice deepened into something almost bestial. You will break, Eleanor. We always break our own. They thought the Holloway legacy had died with the crumbling of the manor walls, that the ivy and the rot had finally claimed its grip on the estate and on the bloodline. But they were wrong. Because evil that's born in stone, in ritual, in blood, doesn't die. It migrates. It hides. It waits. The last surviving Holloway, a woman named Eleanor, moved quietly to the city. No headlines, no property records. But her eyes, those same cold gray Holloway eyes, scanned her new world like a predator studying fresh territory. And within months, she began her work again. She didn't rebuild the manor. She didn't have to. She rebuilt the network. The same invisible web her ancestors spun in the shadows centuries ago. The same whispers, the same trades of influence, the same quiet disappearances no one bothered to connect. Eleanor understood something her ancestors never could. The new world didn't require dungeons. The prison was now inside the mind. Through connections in politics, banking, and private societies, she resurrected the Holloway influence. Stronger than ever, because now it could not be seen. And here's the part history will never write down. Because history itself belongs to families like hers. The night she sealed her claim over the city, she sat in her candlelit apartment, drinking from a black crystal chalice. In the glass, the reflection wasn't her face. It was the manor. Intact, whole, alive. The Holloway power hadn't just survived. It had evolved. The bloodline had learned that in the modern age, shadows are more powerful than walls. You can tear down a building, but not a legacy carved into the will of those who refuse to let go. So remember, the manor isn't gone. It's around you, watching you, moving closer. Every time a deal is struck in the dark, every time someone disappears and no one asks why, every time you feel eyes on you but see nothing, you're there. It's them. And when the time comes, when the Holloways decide it's your turn to be part of their story, you won't hear the door creak open. You'll hear the whisper, "Welcome to the manor."